Is it starting? Are we starting? Hello?
I don't know. I feel like that really made me nervous.
Why would it make it? Why would
you nervous?
Okay, so people who are listening from wherever you are, we just were interrupted by drug dogs. Clearly, no one here had drugs because now we're back. Hopefully, this part's recording. I'm going to try to continue. I've got 10 slides left, and I don't know if I'll get there, but I'm going to try. So, anyways, you see that Roosevelt encourages the independence movement. Panama has belonged to Colombia. Basically, Roosevelt goes in and he tries to buy Panama. Colombia says no. And then he says, oh, hey, the Panamanian revolutionaries are my best friends ever. And he sends a ship right outside of Panama, and Colombia says, you know what, I don't want them that bad. Right, you can have them. And so basically we set up Panama and allow Panama to be its own country in exchange for permanent ownership of the Panama Canal. Now, Jimmy Carter in the 1970s will sign that off and say, hey, 1999, Panama gets the canal back. So we no longer control the Panama Canal, and matter of fact, Carter got a lot of flack for having done that. But you definitely see that Roosevelt kind of sets this tone of interference in Latin America. And this is going to create more resentment in Latin America. You'll see that when you read the Calderon document on Friday. Kind of the feeling about the Americans always showing up and having put in their 2 cents worth. Remember, our perception is that Latin America and Western Hemisphere is our neighborhood, and we get to be we're like the HOA, and we set all the rules, and so that makes us kind of overbearing in a lot of ways. This one. Again, held up the wrong man. Very pro Teddy Roosevelt cartoon. You see Colombia there as kind of the criminal, right? The idea was that Teddy Roosevelt put out the idea, and I don't say put out like he lied. I don't think he lied. The media covered this tension with Colombia as though Colombia was trying to bribe the U.S. for more than what the U.S. wanted to pay. It's really more that Colombia was like, we don't want to sell, so we're going to set the price really high. Anyway, so the perception in the media was that Colombia was trying to manipulate the United States. And then here's the United States, Teddy Roosevelt saying, no, you don't do that to us. So with the whole Panama Canal thing, what you're going to see Teddy Roosevelt doing, and this is another very important thing for Starr and for just to be a smart person, the Roosevelt Corollary. It's built on the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine says, hey, Western Hemisphere is the United States, European powers stay out. The Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine takes one step further, and it says the U.S. has the right to intervene in the Western Hemisphere. That if we feel like there's political instability or there's not going to be peace, we can send troops in. Okay, that's the Roosevelt Corollary. The way he describes it, the way Roosevelt talks about it, is walk softly but carry a big stick. In other words, he's going to tell these Latin American countries, you better make sure that you're creating stability and democracy and capitalism, or else we're going to show up and we're going to do it for you. Okay, so if you don't want us there, you better take care of everything. Okay, and a lot of Latin American countries don't like this. Now, practically speaking, Roosevelt won't use it that much. He's mostly known for, he does go into the Dominican Republic because of some debts. We will see that he sends the U.S. Navy on a tour around the Caribbean and into the Pacific and all this kind of stuff as a way of kind of showing off that we have military muscle. Kind of thing. The way I joke about it is, showing off your guns. And I'm making muscle signs for those of you that can't see. And so so he's trying to show off how strong the U.S. military is to basically back up this idea of walk softly but carry a big stick. Don't make us come over there. Mind your P's and Q's, keep peace and stability, make sure the economy's good, or we're going to come in and interfere. The other thing that the Roosevelt corollary leads to is Teddy Roosevelt getting involved in the Russo-Japanese War. Kind of as a side note, and part of this kind of pre-World War I stuff. So Russia and Japan are actually pretty close together. Japan, by the early 1900s, is starting to be imperialistic on their own. And I can't think of the name of the island, Sakhalin Islands, I believe it is, that they want to get, that's right there off, that technically belongs to Russia. So Japan and Russia go to war. And so Russia actually gets their butt kicked by the Japanese. And the Japanese are like, yes, this great decisive battle. This will also shape some of their World War II fighting
Teachers, please excuse this announcement. We are all clear in the hallways. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
And so the Japanese and the Russians are fighting. The Russians get their tail kicked. This is part of what will set things up in the early 1900s for the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. So you actually have, after the defeat of Russia by the Japanese, you're going to have some serious political instability in Russia that brings about a revolution that ultimately results in the Bolsheviks, Vladimir Lenin, the communists, the execution of the Tsar and his family, and that kind of thing, which we'll touch on more when we get to the World War I. But Teddy Roosevelt will win the Nobel Peace Prize, actually, for negotiating the Treaty of Portsmouth. So just kind of keep that in mind. The U.S., again, this Roosevelt corollary, we've got this great military, we want stability, we want world peace, everybody better mind their P's and Q's, or you know what, we're going to show up and run our mouth, basically. So here's Teddy Roosevelt, another cartoon of him carrying his big stick with our Navy, kind of keeping the Caribbean under control. The Great White Fleet, sending our troops. This is really meant to kind of check Japanese imperialism. Remember I said that they wanted to take over the Sakhalin Islands and defeated Russia. Well, one of the concerns that Roosevelt's going to have is that, well, you know, what if Japan decides they want the Philippines? And we don't want them to do that. So he sends the Great White Fleet on a peaceful mission. We're not there to actually, like, fire on anybody, but we're there to remind the Japanese that you don't want to mess with us, okay? So again, this is part of that backstory with the Japanese as we head towards World War II gradually. When Taft becomes president, so Teddy Roosevelt wins in his own right in 1904. By the 1908 election, Teddy Roosevelt has effectively served 2 terms, right, because he took over very early in McKinley's term. And then you have a 2-term tradition where presidents are only supposed, going back to George Washington, where they're only supposed to serve 2 terms. It's not a constitutional amendment. That's not until after FDR and the 22nd Amendment that you have that 2-term limit. So 2 terms, 22nd, okay? And so Teddy Roosevelt actually tries to honor that, and he says, you know, and he's actually kind of bored with being president. He's ready to go do something different, right? This is a man of action, a man of activity. He feels like he's accomplished a lot as president, and he wants to go do something else. So he kind of handpicks William Howard Taft, who had managed the Philippines, who had been his Secretary of War, was a very smart guy, strong progressive, and he says, I think Taft will make a great president. He's going to administrate. And really, if you study Roosevelt and Taft's relationship at all, it was a friendship, but Roosevelt clearly thought that he had the dominant personality. And so he kind of felt like Taft would just continue with what Roosevelt had set in motion. And so Taft comes into the presidency, and the difference with Taft, remember, he doesn't like the military because he saw what they can do in the Philippines. And he's not nearly as overbearing as Teddy Roosevelt. So while Teddy Roosevelt didn't really send troops in all that often, he talked a big game. He was full of bluster and bluff, right? Taft is way quieter than that. And so what he argues for is that American businesses need to invest in countries, particularly Latin America. Rather than relying on the big stick policy alone, mind your P's and Q's or we send the military in, he's saying we need to invest and encourage capitalism. And so he creates this policy of dollar diplomacy, right? Encouraging investments in Latin America, China, and all over the Western Hemisphere. Now what will happen is that American businesses will go into these countries in Central and South America. Many of them have very weak regimes that tend to be very corrupt. They like getting the American dollars. And it creates kind of, we start economically getting tangled up with these countries that ultimately, by the time you get to Woodrow Wilson, we'll have to send troops in to protect American business interests. Guys, this is what will happen with Cuba. The whole reason we had a Cuban embargo for years and years and years was because we felt like we had to do something because when Castro took over, American businesses lost money, right? So you're going to see that the U.S. is going to end up being involved, even though Taft was trying to avoid that. But you need to understand the concept of dollar diplomacy, which is U.S. investment in these foreign countries as a way of bringing peace and capitalism and all that kind of stuff. Woodrow Wilson will officially stop dollar diplomacy when he wins in 1913. But he'll actually end up having to send the troops in all over the place in Latin America because dollar diplomacy had gotten us economically involved in all these countries. So it kind of like dollar diplomacy comes before Woodrow Wilson's effects. Woodrow Wilson claimed for moral diplomacy. He believed the U.S. should lead as a moral example for democracy and all this kind of stuff. But fundamentally, right, he is going to have to protect American investments. And he also believes that if we lead with this morality and encourage democracy and capitalism, that's going to make these markets friendlier to the United States, okay? But then, like I said, he still continues to protect U.S. interests because these countries in Latin America are very susceptible to turmoil and that kind of thing. So Wilson in Mexico, and kind of again, we're fast forwarding a little bit, so you get to, he wins the presidency in 1912. Beginning in the early 1900s, you have a Mexican Civil War. Remember that Mexico had gotten involved in dollar diplomacy and a lot of American business interests, very corrupt. The Mexican citizens get really mad. They decide to overthrow Porfirio Diaz. He gets kicked out of the country. And you basically have a series of roving gangs. This is where Pancho Villa comes in. And so Pancho Villa is one of these roving gangs. There's a few others. And the names of the leaders are escaping me at the moment. But you have Huerta, that's the guy, his name's up here, and Carranza. So basically Wilson starts trying to pick sides in this whole like civil war in Mexico. And then when the violence spills across the border into the U.S., he sends troops in. And so they start chasing after Pancho Villa because Pancho Villa's group, his gang, are the ones that really kind of spill over. And so he sends American troops in. We actually occupy Veracruz in the early 1900s. And you're going to see that that kind of the first time that we mount guns on an automobile vis-a-vis a tank happens when we're fighting Pancho Villa because the Mexican revolutionaries are on horseback. They're hard to catch. And so you're going to have George Patton as a young man say, hey, if we put a gun on a car, we can chase him down. That's kind of the precursor to a tank. And so you're going to see that the U.S. Really kind of failed to make a big difference in Mexico. This is why you have that period of increased immigration from Mexico. And so Wilson's attempt at having a moral leadership in the world is really not super effective because of what happens in Mexico. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. You also want to remember the Mexican connection because when we talk about causations for World War I, we're going to talk about the Zimmerman telegram, and that connects Mexico to Germany. And one of the reasons why Americans will totally be upset about the Zimmerman telegram is because everybody in 1916, 1917 knows about the history between the U.S. and Mexico, especially under Wilson's administration, how we had sent troops into Veracruz and all that kind of stuff and had these border incursions and hunted down Pancho Villa. So the impact of U.S. imperialism. Progressive imperialism and diplomacy, stressed moralism and order, championed the uplift of non-whites through racist attitudes, and strove to preserve a new frontier and the economic opportunities related to it. So it's really kind of this is the point at which the progressive ideals get very muddled by capitalism, right? When we're trying to preserve economic growth, we're trying to preserve opportunity, this idea of the progressives that we can make the world better, and yet all of that kind of falls apart when you start dealing with the actual tensions of governments and trying to make that work. And yes, I did it with about 30 seconds to spare, even with being interrupted by drug dogs. Thank you. So that is U.S. imperialism. We read the documents on Friday, and we'll kind of put those documents in context with imperialism. Be sure you listen to the progressive lectures. I'll have part 2 recorded, hopefully ASAP, and that's pretty much it.